My name is Maya Hartwell. I'm 29 years old. My dad died on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Thursday evening, my family had already decided I didn't exist. They handed my brother Derek the house keys, the bank card, the stack of folders my dad kept in the fireproof safe in his closet. They set her on the kitchen table, the one where we ate every holiday dinner I can remember, and they divided a life that had taken 61 years to build. Nobody called me. Nobody texted. I found out because my aunt accidentally included me in a group message that was meant for everyone else. When I showed up at the house the next morning, my mom looked at the door like I was a stranger who'd gotten the address wrong. Then, after staring at me for a second too long, she finally tightened her arms across her chest and quietly said,
Maya, Derek is already handling everything with the paperwork and the house, and we honestly didn't think there was really any reason for you to come over today.
And hearing my mother say that less than 2 days after Dad died made something inside me go completely still. Because in that moment, I realized they had already started making decisions about our family without even considering I should be part of them. Derek is handling things, she said. We didn't think you needed to be here. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my father had quietly added my name as joint owner on the family home and every major account 3 months before he passed. He did it without telling a single person, not my mother, not my brother, not even me. He did it because he saw exactly what was coming. And even now, thinking about that still hurts me in a way I don't fully know how to explain. Because while the rest of us were still pretending our family worked a certain way, my father had already realized what would happen to me the moment he was no longer there to stand between us. I remember one conversation we had a few weeks before he passed when he looked at me very carefully and quietly said,
Maya, there are some families where love stays balanced after someone dies. And there are other families where people quietly start disappearing the second the wrong person is gone.
And hearing my father say that back then honestly unsettled me more than I admitted at the time. Because part of me knew he wasn't speaking generally. He was warning me. He already saw exactly what was coming long before anybody else did. And he made sure I'd be protected when it arrived. Before I tell you the rest of this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. I want to know where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand what this family looked like before it broke, to understand what happened when it finally did. Growing up in Claremont, Ohio, the Hartwell family looked like something from a Sunday circular. Brick house on Maple Drive, 2 cars in the driveway, Dad coaching Little League, Mom running the church bake sale, my brother Derek, 4 years older than me, student council president, 3-sport athlete the son people described with words like dependable and sharp and going places, and me, the quiet one, the reader, the girl who spent summer afternoons in the garage with Dad, learning how to fix things that didn't need to be fixed just because she liked knowing how they worked. I loved my father the way you love someone who truly sees you. Gerald Hartwell was a mechanical engineer who came home with motor oil under his fingernails and still managed to ask how my day went before he even took off his boots. He remembered every book I mentioned, every teacher I complained about, every small thing I thought nobody was paying attention to. He was the kind of man who wrote things down because he genuinely didn't want to forget them. Derek got the spotlight. I got something quieter, something steadier. My mother, Patricia, adored Derek in the way that some parents adore their firstborn without fully realizing what that favoritism costs the second child. It wasn't obvious enough to call abuse. That's what made it harder to explain. It was smaller than that, quieter. The kind of favoritism built into everyday family life so deeply that eventually everyone stops noticing it except the child living underneath it. Derek's opinion ended conversations. Derek's plans shaped holidays. Derek's mistakes got explained away while my successes quietly became expected. And one night when I was about 14, I remember sitting at the kitchen table after bringing home straight-A report cards while my mother smiled at Derek across the room and proudly said,
Your brother has always had such natural confidence, Maya. He just walks into a room and people immediately trust him.
And hearing my mother say that while my own report card sat untouched beside her coffee cup honestly taught me something long before I had words for it. In our family, Derek was celebrated for who he naturally was. I was appreciated for how little I needed. I learned to need less. That's what you do when you're the second child in that kind of house. You learn to shrink your appetite for attention so that what you need no longer embarrasses you when it goes unmet. By the time I was 22 and had moved to Columbus for my job in healthcare administration, the distance between me and my family had become mostly geographic instead of emotional. We still talked on birthdays, still saw each other on holidays, still sat around the same kitchen table pretending everything between us worked the way families are supposed to work. Derek talked confidently about real estate markets and investment properties while my mother listened to him like he was already the smartest man in every room he entered. And I mostly did what I had always done, helped clean up after dinner, stayed quiet when conversations became crowded, then eventually wandered out to the garage where Dad always was. Those hours in the garage became the most important part of every visit home, even before I realized why. Because out there, things felt different between us. Quieter, more honest. I remember one winter evening while we were standing beside his workbench, pretending to organize tools we both knew were already organized. My father suddenly looked over at me and softly said,
You know, Maya, you've spent your whole life acting like taking up less space somehow makes everybody else more comfortable. And I wish you'd stop doing that.
And hearing my father say that honestly caught me off guard in a way I still think about now. Because he said it so gently. Not like criticism, like someone noticing an injury you had gotten so used to carrying that you forgot it was visible. Those last conversations in the garage became everything to me later. Because somewhere during my 3rd year living in Columbus, my father got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The kind that moves faster than families can emotionally prepare for. And when he finally made the call to tell someone, he called me first. Not Derek. Me. Dad told me about the cancer on October 14th. I remember the exact date because I wrote it down in the same journal I've kept since I was 15 years old. I had been sitting alone at my kitchen table eating leftover soup straight from the container when my phone lit up with his name. And even now, I still remember the strange feeling I got before answering. Like some part of me already knew the call was going to change something permanent. The second I picked up, his voice sounded softer than usual. Tired in a way I had never heard before. Then after a small pause, he quietly said,
Maya Bear, I need you to let me finish what I'm about to say before you start trying to make it easier for everybody else, okay?
And hearing my father say that instantly made my stomach tighten. Because that sentence alone told me this was serious. Really serious. My father had spent my entire life protecting everyone else from panic. So the moment he started preparing me for bad news before he even spoke it out loud, part of me already knew whatever came next was going to split my life into a before and an after. He told me everything after that, the diagnosis, the timeline, the treatment options the doctors had discussed with him and the ones he had already quietly decided against before even making the phone call. And the entire time he spoke, his voice never sounded afraid to me. Exhausted, yes, but not defeated. There's a difference between those two things, and somehow my father still understood that even while talking about his own death. Then after a long pause on the phone, he said something that confused me at the time, but would eventually change everything.
I'm not telling Derek yet, Maya, because before any of that happens, there are a few things I need to quietly put into place first, so you'll understand certain decisions later.
And hearing my father say that immediately made me sit up straighter at the kitchen table, because there was something unusual in his voice, not fear, certainty, like he had already spent weeks thinking 10 steps ahead of everyone else. I asked him what he meant by that, but he stayed quiet for a second before softly saying,
Just trust me for now, Bear, okay? Trust your old man a little longer before you start worrying about things you can't see yet.
And honestly, I did trust him. Completely. Because my father had spent my entire life quietly protecting me in ways nobody else ever fully noticed. So even though I didn't understand what he was preparing for yet, some part of me already knew he was trying to build something solid underneath my feet before he was gone. Over the next 3 months, my father drove to Columbus twice. He told my mother both times that he was meeting a former colleague. He wasn't. He was meeting with an attorney named Richard Vance, whose name I would not learn until much later. sitting in Richard Vance's waiting room going over paperwork that made the floor feel like it was shifting under my feet. What my father did during those 3 months was precise, legal, and completely invisible to everyone else in the family. He added my name to the deed of the Maple Drive property as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. Under Ohio law, that meant when he died, the property passed directly to me by operation of law. Outside of the will, outside of probate. The moment he took his last breath, that house became mine. He added my name to his savings account, his money market account, and the investment account he'd been building since 1989. Joint account holders with right of survivorship. Same principle. The moment he passed, those funds were legally ours jointly and then fully mine. He didn't tell me what he'd done, only that it was done. He passed on a Tuesday in March, quietly in the room he'd slept in for 31 years. My mother was with him. I arrived 3 hours later. Derek arrived that evening. By Thursday, Derek was holding the house keys. I want to tell you what it felt like to walk into that house on the morning after my father died and realize that my family had already begun redistributing his life without me. The kitchen table was covered in folders, bank statements, utility bills, Dad's retirement paperwork, the deed to the garage storage unit. Every important piece of his life spread across the table like the decisions had already been made before I even walked through the front door. And what honestly hit me hardest was seeing Derek sitting in Dad's chair at the head of the table like the transition had happened automatically overnight. Mom sat beside him quietly nodding while he talked. Carol Briggs sat there too for some reason, watching the whole thing with the uncomfortable expression of someone who knew they were witnessing a family conversation that should probably include one more person. Then, while flipping through one of the folders, Derek glanced up at me and calmly said,
I'm already organizing all the financial stuff and talking to the realtor, Maya, so we're trying to keep everything moving without making this more complicated than it already is.
And hearing my brother say that while sitting in our father's chair honestly made the entire room feel unfamiliar to me for a second, because nobody had invited me into the discussion. They had invited me into the aftermath of decisions already made. And standing there looking at those folders spread across the kitchen table, I realized my father had only been gone for 2 days, and somehow my place in the family had already started shrinking around me. I sat down. Nobody offered me coffee. Nobody moved anything to make space for me. I pulled a chair from the side of the table, a chair that wasn't at the table at all, and sat where I could reach the edge. What followed was 40 minutes of Derek explaining, in the tone of a man delivering a presentation to shareholders, what would happen next. He had already spoken to the bank. He had already spoken to a real estate agent. He had already called Dad's financial advisor. He had a folder for each category. When he was done, I asked what was being left to me. The room shifted almost imperceptibly after that. Not dramatic silence. Something more familiar. The subtle discomfort families create when someone asks a question that threatens the version of events everyone else has already agreed to accept. Derek opened one of the folders in front of him and answered in the same calm, professional tone he had been using the entire morning.
Dad's will leaves the house to me, and there's a smaller savings account with around $11,000 that gets divided between both of us.
The way he said it made my father's entire life sound strangely transactional. A house, an account, a clean division of assets. Like grief itself could be organized into percentages if you stayed emotionally detached enough. But the numbers themselves weren't even the part that unsettled me most. What unsettled me was how completely normal this arrangement already sounded to everyone else sitting at that table. A $400,000 house, hundreds of thousands in investments, and somehow my place in all of it had already been reduced to half of a small savings account without anyone seeming to question it. That doesn't seem right, I said quietly. My mother set down her coffee mug. Maya, your father made his wishes clear. Can I see the will? Derek slid a document across the table. It was real. I read it twice. It said exactly what Derek had described. The house went to Derek. The investment account split evenly between them. A small savings account split between Derek and me. What the will did not account for was what my father had done outside of it. So I sat there quietly with my hands folded in my lap while Derek continued outlining his plans for the future, like the entire situation had already been finalized. He talked about selling the house by summer, liquidating the investments, paying off his mortgage, setting money aside for what he confidently referred to as a family stability account for him and my mother. A family stability account. The phrase itself stayed with me because of how naturally he said it, as if the definition of family inside that kitchen had already been narrowed down without anyone needing to say it directly. I listened for almost 10 more minutes before finally interrupting him with the one question nobody else seemed interested in asking. What about me? Derek looked at me with the same expression he'd used our entire lives whenever I questioned something he considered already settled. Then he leaned back slightly in Dad's chair and said,
You still get your portion of the savings account, Maya. It comes out to around $5,500, which is what Dad decided was fair.
Fair. That was the word that caught in my mind afterward. Not because of the amount itself, but because nobody at that table seemed to hear how strange it was to describe a daughter's place in her father's life using the language of a financial compromise. What Dad wanted, I said, and something in my voice must have shifted because my mother immediately looked up from her coffee mug. Not concerned, guarded, like she already recognized the beginning of a conversation she did not want to have. Then before I could even say anything else, she cut in sharply and said,
Maya, please don't turn this into another situation where everything becomes emotionally complicated just because you're unhappy with the decision.
The sentence landed with the kind of familiarity that only exists inside families. Not shocking, not new, just deeply practiced. Because what my mother was really saying had nothing to do with money or wills or savings accounts. What she meant was, don't disrupt the version of reality everyone else here has already agreed to accept. I looked over at Carol Briggs after that. She had suddenly become extremely interested in the grain of the kitchen table. And honestly, that detail stayed with me afterward more than almost anything else, because even she looked uncomfortable enough to avoid eye contact, which meant somewhere in that room, at least one person understood exactly what was happening to me. Okay, I said. I picked up my purse and I went home. I want to pause here for just a moment, because I think some of you already know how this feels. The moment when a family decision is presented to you as a finished conclusion, when your absence from the planning process is treated like a courtesy you should be grateful for, when being called difficult is the penalty for having questions. Had you ever been in a room where your own family looked at you like a problem they'd already budgeted for? Type the word "seen" in the comments if you know what that feels like. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now, because what comes next is the part that changes everything. I drove back to Columbus that night, 4 hours alone in the car. I didn't turn on music. I didn't call anyone. I just drove and I thought about my father's voice on that October phone call. There are things I've already started taking care of. Things that are going to make sense later. Later was now. I called Richard Vance's office the next morning. I didn't have his number. I had spent the 8 months since my father's diagnosis convincing myself that whatever Dad had taken care of would reveal itself when it needed to. I had trusted him. I had not asked for details. Now I was sitting in my apartment at 7 in the morning, wondering if I had misunderstood the whole conversation entirely. I found Richard Vance, attorney at law, by calling 6 different firms in the Columbus area and asking if they had any record of a Gerald Hartwell as a client. The 6th one asked me to hold. Richard Vance himself picked up. He had the voice of a man who had spent 50 years delivering news that landed hard. Measured, warm, deliberate. Miss Hartwell, he said, I've been expecting your call. I want you to know that your father was very specific. I wasn't to reach out to you unless you reached out first. He said you'd call when you were ready. I gripped the phone. What exactly did he do? Can you come in? There's paperwork I need to walk you through. It's going to be easier in person. I drove back to Claremont the following day. Richard Vance's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Commerce Street, above a dry cleaner and a CPA's office. The waiting room had 3 chairs and a plant that someone was clearly devoted to. His assistant offered me water twice. I said yes the 2nd time. Richard Vance was 60-something, silver-haired, with reading glasses he lowered to the end of his nose when he was making a point. He set a folder on the desk between us. Your father first came to see me in October, he said. He had received his diagnosis 2 weeks prior. He was very calm about it, purposeful. He knew exactly what he wanted to accomplish. He opened the folder and turned it toward me. The first document was a warranty deed for the property at 411 Maple Drive, Claremont, Ohio. The grantees were listed as Gerald William Hartwell and Maya Ann Hartwell as joint tenants with right of survivorship. I read my name 3 times. This was recorded with the county recorder's office on November 9th, Richard said. Your father signed it, it was witnessed and notarized, and it was filed the same week. As of that date, you and your father jointly own the home at 411 Maple Drive. He turned to the next page. When your father passed, the property transferred to you by operation of law. There is no probate process for a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. The will is irrelevant to this property. The house is already yours. The room was completely silent. The accounts, he continued, sliding the next pages across, were converted to joint accounts with survivorship rights on December 3rd. Your father added your name at the branch level. These are the bank confirmations. He pointed to each line. The savings account, the money market account, and the self-directed investment account. All 3 became solely yours upon his death. I stared at the papers. He never told me. He said he didn't want you carrying the weight of knowing. He said if you knew, you'd be worried about the confrontation that would follow, and he didn't want your last months with him to be spent in anticipation of a fight. Richard set down the folder. He said you'd already been carrying too much for too long. He wanted to give you one thing you didn't have to earn. I pressed my hands flat on the desk. What does this mean for Derek? For the will? The will stands for whatever assets fall under the estate. The problem for Derek is that the major assets don't fall under the estate anymore. The house transferred outside the will. The 3 accounts transferred outside the will. What remains in the estate is the retirement account, a small personal checking account, and the contents of the property. The retirement account did list Derek as beneficiary, which your father left intentionally. He said Derek would need something. I let out a slow breath. Richard leaned forward slightly. Miss Hartwell, your brother doesn't know any of this. Your mother doesn't know. As far as they are aware, they are operating according to the will, which gave Derek the house and the investment account. They've likely already begun taking steps based on that assumption. He said he was going to sell the house by summer. Richard's expression did not change. If your brother attempts to list or transfer the property without your consent, he will encounter a title search that shows your name on the deed. No title company will clear that transaction without your signature. He slid the folder across the desk. Your father was very thorough. He wanted you protected. The rest is up to you. I sat in my car in Richard Vance's parking lot for 45 minutes. The folder was on the passenger seat. My father's handwriting was on a sticky note inside the front cover. He must have added it the last time he visited. It said, Maya Bear. I'm sorry I couldn't say this out loud. I love you the most quietly and the most completely. Don't let them take what's yours. I didn't cry in the parking lot. I couldn't. I was beyond crying. I had arrived at something colder and cleaner than grief. A kind of clear-eyed calm that I'd never felt before. Like the world had gone very still. I put the car in drive and started toward Maple Drive. Not to confront anyone. Not yet. I drove past the house slowly. Derek's truck was in the driveway. There was a real estate sign leaning against the garage. Not planted, not yet, but leaning, ready. I kept driving. I went to the grocery store, bought coffee and bread, and drove back to Columbus. Because my father had taught me something in that garage over 30 years of fixing things that didn't need to be fixed. The most important step in any repair is understanding what you're working with before you pick up a single tool. I spent the next 10 days understanding. I called Derek on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the house key ceremony at the kitchen table. He answered on the second ring. Hey! His voice had that careful tone people use when they know a difficult conversation is eventually coming, but haven't decided yet whether they want conflict or resolution. I told him I just wanted to check in and asked how things were coming with the estate. There was a slight pause before he explained he was already meeting with a realtor the following week and expected the house to be listed by April. That part stayed with me afterward. The speed of it. Not because selling the house itself was unreasonable, but because grief inside our family was already being treated like a logistical process instead of an emotional one. Then after I asked what would happen after the sale, Derek slipped into the familiar tone he always used whenever he believed he was being practical and fair at the same time.
We'll use the proceeds to make sure Mom is financially secure. And obviously, you'll still receive your portion from the savings account exactly like Dad intended.
Receive your portion. The wording itself stayed with me after we hung up, like I wasn't part of the family being protected, just someone scheduled to receive a carefully measured payout once the important decisions had already been made elsewhere. Right, I said. $5,500. Correct. Okay. Thanks for the update. I hung up. I called Carla Meesen's office the following morning to ask how a property listing worked when both a will and a deed were involved. I didn't give my last name. The person at the front desk explained that any property listing required a clear title search, which would identify all recorded owners, and that all identified owners would need to provide authorization before the listing could proceed. What happens if someone tries to list a property without one owner's authorization? I asked. There was a brief pause on the line before she calmly explained.
The title search would stop the transaction immediately because every legal owner has to approve the listing before anything can move forward.
And hearing that was the first moment since my father died that I fully understood how carefully he had planned everything. Because suddenly I could picture him sitting quietly inside that Columbus law office in November, already anticipating conversations the rest of us had not reached yet. Then almost immediately, I remembered something he used to say whenever we worked in the garage together, and a repair looked overwhelming at first glance.
Most disasters can be prevented early if you quietly fix the weak part before anybody notices it cracking.
And sitting there alone at my kitchen table with my coffee growing cold beside me, I realized that was exactly what my father had spent his final months doing, not reacting emotionally, preparing structurally, the same way he fixed everything else in life, patiently, methodically, fixing the weakness before the collapse ever happened. How long does that typically take to surface? The title search runs before the listing agreement is signed. It comes up at the very beginning. Thank you, I said. I hung up, sat with my coffee, thought about my father pulling his truck into the parking lot of a Columbus law office in November, his hands careful and deliberate on the steering wheel, doing what he'd always done in the garage, fixing things before they broke. I gave Derek 9 more days. The call came on a Wednesday at 11:47 in the morning. I was sitting in a meeting at work when Derek's name suddenly flashed across my phone screen, and something about seeing it in the middle of the day immediately told me the title search had finally happened. I excused myself, stepped into the hallway, and answered. The second I heard Derek's voice, I knew everything had changed. Not angry yet, too stunned for anger, like someone whose understanding of reality had just been rearranged without warning. Then, after several seconds of happy silence, he finally said,
Maya, the title company just ran the ownership search on the house, and somehow your name is legally attached to the deed.
Somehow. That word stayed with me, because even then, Derek still sounded like he believed there had to be some kind of mistake hidden underneath all of this. But there wasn't, so I calmly told him I already knew, and the silence that followed felt enormous. Not confusion anymore. Calculation. Then finally, in a completely different voice, Derek quietly asked how long I had known. I told him about Richard Vance, about the meetings in October and November, about the deed, the survivorship rights, the accounts, and after I finished explaining everything, neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence had weight now. The kind that only exists when two people suddenly realize they have been participating in completely different versions of the same story. Then Derek spoke again, but this time the disbelief had started turning into accusation.
You sat in that kitchen, listening to us make plans for the house and the accounts, while already knowing Dad had legally transferred everything before he died?
The question itself revealed something important to me in that moment. Derek still believed the betrayal in this story began with me staying quiet, not with them excluding me from the conversation in the first place. So I reminded him of exactly what happened after Dad died, the phone calls I never received, the meetings I was never included in, The folders already spread across the kitchen table before anyone even thought to contact me. And for the first time since this entire process began, Derek had no immediate response prepared. Because deep down he understood I was right. Then finally, after another long silence, he said quietly,
I need to talk to Mom before this turns into something none of us know how to fix anymore.
And honestly, hearing my brother say that affected me more than the legal revelation itself, because for the first time in our entire lives, Derek no longer sounded certain he was the person automatically entitled to control the outcome. I know, I said. I'll be there Saturday. I let him hang up first. I want to be honest with you about those 3 days between Derek's call and that Saturday. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt the thing that nobody warns you about when you're waiting for justice to arrive. I felt grief. Not for myself. For my father, who had loved his family well enough to spend the last months of his life quietly arranging protection for the daughter he knew would need it. Who had sat in a lawyer's office off Commerce Street instead of resting. Who had done all of it alone and in silence because he understood that love is sometimes the decisions you make when no one is watching. I cried in my car on the way to Claremont on Saturday. Not a breakdown, a quiet overflow, the kind that comes when something has been held for a very long time. I cried because I missed him and because he had seen me. The house smelled exactly the same when I walked in. Coffee and that specific soap my mother had used for 20 years and something faintly of the cedar chest in the hallway. Derek was at the kitchen table. My mother was at the kitchen table. The folder was there, but most of the papers were gone. Derek must have taken them back when the title search came up with my name. My Aunt Rosalie, my dad's younger sister, was also present. She'd driven in from Cincinnati. I hadn't known she was coming. I found out later that she'd called Derek the night before and said she didn't think this conversation should happen without her there. Rosalie had always been the one in the family who understood that the person left out of a room was usually the person who needed to be in it most. I sat down. Nobody offered me coffee this time either, but Rosalie stood up and poured me a mug without asking. My mother spoke first. Maya, I want you to understand that your father and I discussed his wishes at length. Mom, I kept my voice even. What he discussed with you was separate from what he legally arranged. Both things can be true. He left the house to Derek. He left what he had legal authority to leave at the time of the will. He changed the legal ownership of the house before he died. He had the right to do that. It's called an inter vivos transfer, and Richard Vance can send you whatever documentation you need. Derek's jaw was set. He was holding himself very still the way he did when he was deciding how much of his anger to express. You knew about this for weeks. You've had Dad's keys since the night he died. I didn't think the timeline was the issue. This is not what Dad wanted. I held Derek's gaze. Dad drove to Columbus twice in his last 3 months to make sure this was done correctly. He hired an attorney. He signed documents. He had them recorded. If this wasn't what he wanted, he had months to change it. He didn't change it. He was sick. My mother's voice cracked. He wasn't thinking clearly at the end. Dr. Marsden's office can send you documentation of his cognitive status during that period. Richard Vance can also attest to his capacity when the documents were signed. Both visits, he was articulate, purposeful, and legally competent. The kitchen was very quiet. Rosalie set down her coffee mug. Patricia. Her voice was gentle but not soft. I need to say something, and I need you to hear me. Gerald loved Derek. You know that. But Gerald also knew how this family worked. He knew how these conversations always went. She looked at my mother steadily. He spent his whole life watching Maya come in second, and he couldn't fix that while he was here. This was the one thing he could fix. My mother's eyes filled. He should have talked to me, she said. He talked to me, I said quietly. He called me the day he was diagnosed. He called me first. Something shifted in her face. She hadn't known that. He wanted me to know he was taking care of it, I said. He didn't want me to worry. He said to trust him. I stopped, swallowed. I trusted him. The silence this time was different, less like a standoff and more like a wound finally given air. Derek put his hands flat on the table. I recognized the gesture. It was our father's gesture. Something about that detail almost broke me open right there in the kitchen. "So what happens now?" he asked. "That's what I came to talk about," I said. "I want to pause right here, because what happened next was the part I've been thinking about for 10 days. Not the legal part. Anyone can call an attorney. What I've been thinking about was the human part, the choice I had to make about what kind of person I wanted to be at the end of this. I could have said, the house is mine, the accounts are mine, figure it out. That would have been legal. It would have been technically within my rights. But my father didn't do what he did so that I could win against my family. He did it so that I could stand in that kitchen and not be afraid anymore. There's a difference. If you've ever had to decide between being right and being whole, drop a comment. Tell me what you chose. I want to know. Now, back to the kitchen on Maple Drive. "I'm not selling the house," I said. Derek's expression braced. "I'm also not kicking anyone out. Mom, if you want to stay here, you stay here. This is your home. It was your home for 31 years. I'm not interested in changing that." My mother's shoulders dropped from somewhere near her ears. "What I am interested in," I continued, "is being part of decisions. Actual decisions. Not updates after the fact. Not the version of events where Derek handles everything and I find out through a group text." I looked at my brother. Dad handled the paperwork because he knew this family defaults to leaving me out and asking us to be different than that, starting now. Derek was quiet for a long moment. "The investment account," he said. $300,000. "Yes." He left the retirement account to me. "Yes. Intentionally," Richard said. "He wanted you to have something." Derek rubbed his face with both hands. "I've been paying the mortgage on this house since January. When he got too sick to work, I hadn't known that." "How much?" I asked. $4,600 a month. I did the math. 3 months. $13,800. "I'll pay you back every dollar," I said, "from the investment account. And going forward, we split the costs on the house equally until we figure out what makes sense long term." He looked at me, searching for something. I think he was looking for the angle, the catch, the version of this that was still a power move. "Why?" he asked. "Because he was our dad," I said, "and he loved both of us, just in ways we didn't always see at the same time." Rosalie wiped her eyes. My mother let out a sound I didn't have a word for. Not a sob exactly, more like something that had been held in a very small space finally finding room. Derek didn't say anything else for a minute. Then he stood up, walked to the counter, poured himself a coffee he didn't drink and said, "I didn't know he called you first. I know you didn't. He was always closer to you. I used to think it meant something was wrong with me." I stared at my brother, 33 years old, and I had never heard him say anything like that. "He was proud of you," I said. "He talked about you all the time. He just worried about me more." I paused. "He thought you could handle things. He wasn't always sure I could." Derek turned around. His face was doing something complicated. "You could handle things, Maya. You always could. You were just never given the chance." Something cracked open between us. Not fixed, not healed, just cracked open the way things need to before light can get in. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing about grief with paperwork attached is simple. But they were honest, which was new for us. Derek and I met with Richard Vance together. We went through everything, every document, every account. We hired an accountant to help us understand the tax implications. We made a schedule for the mortgage contributions. We had an argument in Richard's waiting room about the investment account that got loud enough that his assistant knocked softly on the door to check if everything was okay. Everything was okay. Everything was not entirely okay, but we were working through it together, in the same room, with our names on the same documents. That was something new. My mother called me 2 weeks after that Saturday kitchen conversation. Not Derek first. Me. She called to ask if I wanted some of Dad's books, the ones in the garage. "He always said those were yours," she told me. "He told me years ago. I've forgotten until I found the note he left on the shelf." Dad had taped a strip of masking tape along the third shelf of the garage bookcase. In his handwriting, In blue marker, it read, Maya's Books. Don't touch. It had probably been there for a decade and none of us had noticed. I drove to Claremont on a Sunday morning and filled 2 boxes with those books. My mother made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table together, just the 2 of us, and she talked about my father in a way she never had in front of Derek. About the early years. About the way he used to read to me when I was small, in the garage with a flashlight, while she thought we were just fixing something. I hadn't known she knew about that. I wasn't a perfect mother to you, she said. It came out simply. No performance, no prelude. You didn't have to be perfect, I said. I leaned on Derek too much. Expected you to be fine without the leaning. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I think part of me knew you were fine and I let that become an excuse not to look closer. Dad looked closer, I said. He always did. She smiled, not quite reaching her eyes. He said you were like him, that you process things quietly and deeply, and that anyone who mistook your quiet for absence was missing the whole thing. I held the coffee mug and didn't speak for a moment. He was right, I finally said. She nodded. I know that now. 4 months after my father passed, I drove back to Claremont on a Saturday in July. The garage was exactly as he'd left it. Tools on their pegboard, labeled in his handwriting. The workbench level, swept clean. A mug on the corner of the bench that still had a faint ring of coffee stain around the bottom. I sat down on the stool he always used and I just breathed for a while. Then I picked up his notebook. He kept a spiral-bound notebook in the second drawer for project notes. The last entry was dated November 22nd, a month after his diagnosis. He'd written a list, not a dramatic letter, not a goodbye, just a list. Check the will dates, call Vance, change the deed, talk to the bank, leave the note on the shelf, call Maya Thursday. At the bottom, in different ink, like it was added later, make sure she knows the garage is hers too. I read it 3 times. Then I put the notebook back in the drawer, went into the backyard, and cried for a long time in the way you cry when you have finally given yourself permission. My dad had been methodical to the end. He'd made a list, and he'd worked through it. He'd protected me the way he always had, quietly, practically, without making a production of it. He hadn't needed me to know. He just needed it to be done. That's who he was. Here's what I know now that I didn't know the Thursday morning he called me to say he was sick. Grief doesn't follow the order you expect. I thought losing him would feel like a wall. Instead, it felt like finally understanding a language I'd been hearing my whole life. Every quiet thing he ever did, every book left on a shelf, every Saturday in the garage, every first phone call made sense in a new way. He'd been saying something to me for 29 years. He just said most of it in actions instead of words. The house is still on Maple Drive. Derek and I both contribute to the costs now. My mother lives there. She started calling me on Thursdays instead of when she needs something, which is a change I didn't ask for but noticed. Derek and I are not the siblings we could have been if things had been different from the beginning, but we are becoming something we weren't before, honest with each other. That's not nothing. That's actually a great deal. I have not sold a single thing from that investment account except the portion that covered Derek's 3 months of mortgage payments. The rest I have left alone. It feels like it should be tended before it's spent. I'm still figuring out what that means, and the garage on Maple Drive is mine. The tools are still on the pedboard. I've started going on weekends, not to fix anything in particular, just to sit on the stool my father sat on and breathe the specific smell of that room, and think about a man who drove to Columbus in November with bad news in his body and a list in his potty and a list in his pocket, making sure that the daughter who'd been quietly getting through things her whole life would have solid ground to stand on after he was gone. He gave me the house. He gave me the accounts. He gave me the accounts. He gave me legal standing and documented rights and a folder full of papers that Richard Vance assembled with perfect precision. But what he actually gave me was the thing he put in the note on the bookshelf and the list in the spiral notebook and the first phone call on a Thursday in October. He gave me proof that he had seen me, that he had always seen me. No will can document that. No deed can contain it, but it's the thing I carry now, heavier than any account balance, more permanent than any property title. He knew what was coming. He built the shelter before I knew I'd need one. And when the storm arrived and my family handed the keys to someone else without calling my name, his name was already on the wall behind them. Mine was too. If you're watching this and someone in your family has made you feel like your absence from their plans is a compliment, I want you to hear me. Being quietly depended on and being seen are not the same thing. You deserve the second one. Not someday, not after you've proven enough, not as a reward for being easy. You deserve it because you exist and you matter. And if you have someone in your life who sees you that quietly and that completely apparent, a mentor, a friend who leaves notes on shelves and makes lists and drives long distances to make sure you're protected, hold on to them while you have them. Say thank you out loud while you still can. That's the thing I wish I'd done more of. That's the thing I'll carry for the rest of my life. My name is Maya Hartwell. I'm 29 years old. My father is gone, and because of what he did, I have a house and a garage and a bookshelf with a masking tape label and 2 boxes of books and the slow, difficult, real beginning of a family that finally has to include me. He made sure of it. It turns out that's enough. Before you go, I have one question for you. If someone who loved you quietly and completely were to leave you one thing, not money, not property, just one thing, what would you want it to be? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, if it stayed with you, if it made you think about someone you love or someone who loved you, share it. Someone else needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the next one. Check the description for more stories from this channel. I'll see you there.